We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
The US looks as though it may be on the verge of military action in the Middle East once again. This time, the target will be Damascus rather than Baghdad. But 1 decade after shock and awe, protests are underway, and the same legal debate is raging. Is the US right to ignore the deeply divided UN Security Council? And would a war without its authorization be illegal under international law? President Obama is making a moral argument, saying a red line has been crossed, that the use of chemical weapons on the 21st of August violated a norm of humanity. Among the world's contemporary experts in philosophy, one man's work stands out. Professor Peter Singer doesn't use the dry academic language of his peers. Instead, he's provided clear yet controversial answers on moral issues like euthanasia, bioethics, animal rights and global poverty. Now we ask one of the world's best-known philosophers about, among other issues, the use of chemical weapons in Syria and the moral case for military intervention. Professor Peter Singer, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera. A lot of our viewers will already be aware of your work. Some perhaps won't, and what you actually do. So can I start at the beginning? You're an expert in ethics and morals. What exactly are ethics and morals, and how do we decide exactly what they are?
Well, ethics is the study of what we ought to do, of how we ought to live. So it's asking the most fundamental questions about our choices, about the way we live our life. And morals, I think, is more or less the same. Sometimes it has a different meaning in popular discourse. It's maybe more closely related to things like sexual morality, but it's hard to draw a difference. They're slippery concepts. So really what I'm doing is I'm asking questions about how we ought to live. I'm looking at some of the answers that have been offered, both traditionally by philosophers and also contemporary answers. And if you say who decides, I would say, well, we all decide that. We try to decide on the basis of our reasoning and our thought.
Clearly now, at the moment, there is an issue of life and death facing the President of the United States and Congress about war in Syria. I'd like to get your take on that. The idea of going to war because of the use of chemical weapons. Do you support that idea?
War is always, should be always, the last resort. And the question is whether that is really the case here. And there's a further question that you always have to ask, and that is, I think, will the consequences of going to war be better than the alternatives? Now, you could say that if the evidence is compelling, and of course I haven't personally studied it, but if the evidence is compelling that the Assad regime used chemical weapons, then you might say there is no other way of preventing him doing that again, stopping him, other than showing him that there are very serious consequences, which really means going to war in some way with him. And I think there is a good argument for saying that we have a ban on the use of chemical weapons, and if that ban is to mean something, then people who violate it have to feel the consequences. But the question is, can those consequences be limited to Assad and his regime, or are they going to also affect other people who are innocent of the use of chemical weapons and who will be affected by the strikes, by the retaliation? So that's the real danger, whether it can really be made so precise, so surgical, as the expression is used, that it's not going to affect
I'd like
others.
to come back to this surgical strike they keep talking about. But can I read you first a quote from Secretary of State John Kerry? He said, "This debate is about the world's red line, a red line that anyone with a conscience ought to draw." And he described the use of chemical weapons as a moral obscenity. As an expert in ethics, do you agree with that?
I do agree that the use of chemical weapons is a moral obscenity, yes, because I mean, they're very undiscriminating in whom they affect. So you spread them around, and obviously civilians are very likely to get killed, and in this case it seems quite clear that civilians and small children were killed and were suffered from them. So I agree with that statement of Kerry's that this is something that the world has basically agreed should not be done, and I think with justice.
You say that, but I know you've done a lot of work on pain, and pain in humans and pain in animals. What is the difference, dying from suffocation, from the use of a poison gas or even a nerve gas, or being hit by an artillery shell and losing your legs and bleeding to death? Is there a difference?
They obviously can both be extremely painful. The point is, I think, that if we can stop one bad thing happening, the fact that we can't stop other bad things happening is not a reason against stopping the one bad thing we can. So we can define chemical weapons, and chemical and biological warfare, I think, is what the treaty defines. We can set that aside. We can say, here's something we can all agree is evil and has also generally rather little military justification. We cannot, the way the world is, we cannot prohibit the use of artillery shells. Would be great if we could prohibit all military aggression, of course. But if we can't, let's at least stop what we can stop.
There are some that say, though, that the death toll now in Syria, the official figures, I think, the UN figures, are 100,000. People have said to me they believe it could be 150,000. Why act now after about 1,000 people, maybe 1,500 people were killed in the chemical attack? Why not act as this death toll has been mounting over the last 2.5 years? Why have they not acted before?
There's a case for a responsibility to protect civilians. I think that has been well made in other cases. And the question, though, always is, can we do this effectively without causing more loss of life and more suffering than we're preventing? And I think the situation in Syria was quite complex. It's not clear that we could have intervened in a way that would have prevented the deaths of civilians at a time when we could say there will clearly be more civilians killed if we don't intervene than if we do. That's the question that you really have to ask.
Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons back in 1988 in Halabja. He killed 5,000 people. The world did nothing then. Is there a difference in your view between the cases?
No, not at all. I think it's a moral outrage that the Reagan administration did not do anything against Saddam Hussein when he used chemical weapons, but indeed at that time was really supporting him in the conflict with Iran.
How important do you think is, in all this, and we're all having to trust the information we're being given, is the intelligence? Because some of the estimates vary just to the death toll of the number of people who died in this chemical attack. The US saying 1,429, the France saying possibly that's the right figure, but they can only confirm 281 deaths.
I think the question really is, were chemical weapons used by the Assad regime? And if so, I don't think it really makes a huge difference if it's 200 or 1,200. There were some lingering doubts, I believe, as to whether it possibly could have been used by the rebels, perhaps in an attempt to get the United States to intervene. That's the doubt that I would need to be reassured about, that the evidence is very, very strong that it must have been the Assad regime that used them.
Of course, there's another element in all this, and that's international law. Now, international law, if you read the UN Charter, says you can go to war for self-defence, or you can go to war otherwise with the agreement of the UN Security Council. That's not going to happen. Obama says he's not even going to seek the agreement of the UN Security Council. So an illegal war, but the fact that it's morally justified, does that trump that?
I mean, international law is an evolving thing, and I think the idea that there's a responsibility to protect is something that has risen in the last decade or so. There is a question as to what do you do if there is a clear case of a responsibility to protect, and there are powers with sufficient force to intervene and to do that effectively, but there is one power, let's say, blocking the UN with one of the veto powers. I think you still ought to intervene. I think, for example, there ought to have been clearly intervention in Rwanda, where at very little cost, if it had come at the right time, perhaps 800,000 lives could have been saved. And I would say that if there were one of the veto powers in the Security Council that at that time had said, no, we're not going to support this intervention, other nations should have said, what is about to happen is so horrible and such a clear case that we're justified in intervening.
Obviously, Syria is a long way away from here in the US. It's not in America's backyard. Does the geography of the situation in any way affect whether a nation should help or not?
No, I don't think it does anymore. I mean, I'm reminded of Neville Chamberlain's remark about the fact that possibly Britain was going to go to war in 1938 about a faraway country of which we know little. He meant Czechoslovakia, which now doesn't seem very far from Britain at all. I think the world has really shrunk, and given the communications, given the means of delivering military force all over the world, I don't think it's really relevant whether it's here on the American continent or somewhere else in the world.
Of course, the other issue is the possible unintended consequences. Saddam Hussein was toppled, and no one, I think, could have predicted the bloodshed and death toll that followed that.
That's correct, and of course, you know, really what we need to see in Syria is an end to the war. And if military intervention could rapidly end the war and achieve a civilian regime that would try to heal the country, I would be all in favour of that. But as you say, one can't foresee what will happen, and it's very difficult to see how that would happen in Syria now. But that's really what people ought to be talking about in a way, even more than the chemical weapon issue.
Can I ask you about another aspect of the Syrian conflict, another moral aspect of the Syrian conflict? I've spent time in Syria in the last couple of years. It's really desperate there. We know that the regime over the last 40 years has been a really repressive regime, torturing people. We know in cases the opposition does some pretty bad things. There are people being faced with very tough choices, whether to inform on friends, on colleagues, whether to collude with the various authorities, whether they are the regime or the opposition. The fact they're in a place with such threat and hardship, does that make you forgive them a bit for those sort of things that they might end up doing?
Well, I think one might judge actions wrong, but not really blame people because of the pressures that they're under. I mean, not regard them as moral monsters for doing things which, if they'd done them calmly with no pressure, you would regard them as moral monsters. So yes, I think you always ought to ask yourself, can I be confident that if I were in that situation, I would have stood up and done the right thing, rather than having done the thing that would have saved my skin or perhaps even saved me from torture.
Another terrible aspect of this is the humanitarian situation, and now over 2 million refugees in those neighbouring countries that are struggling to cope. Do you think the world is doing enough about this situation, or do you think the states of the United Nations, those around the Security Council, should at this time hang their heads in shame?
I think we should all in the affluent nations be ashamed of the lack of resources that we put towards essentially helping people in great need, whether they are refugees who have fled from the conflict in Syria, or whether there are people who are suffering from simply extreme poverty in a country where there just isn't enough to provide for everyone. So it's a more general issue to me. It's not just a question of humanitarian aid for those who are in refugee camps. It's the fact that according to UNICEF we have nearly 7 million children dying every year from preventable poverty-related diseases, things like diarrhea or pneumonia or measles or malaria, things that people don't die from in the developed world. And in a way, terrible as the situation is in Syria, and as you said, maybe it's 100,000, maybe it's 150,000 who've died there. During those same months that this war has gone on, it's undoubtedly millions of people who've died from preventable poverty-related causes. So I think the shame of the affluent world is not so much that we're not doing more to help the Syrian refugees, though we certainly should, but that we also ignore what's going on all the time in the background, which is not all in one place, doesn't make such good television, but is, when you put it all together, a much greater tragedy.
And you've written quite a lot about personal charity. Is this the role of governments, or should you and me be doing more?
I would certainly like governments to be doing more. I would like governments to be increasing the amount of foreign aid that they give, at a very minimum to the UN target set many years ago of 0.7% of gross national product, which is a target that's only been met by half a dozen nations, some of the Scandinavian nations, the Netherlands, and so on. The United States, for example, is very far from meeting it still. So yes, I think governments should increase the amount of foreign aid they give. I think they should actually target the aid more effectively at the global poor. But we can't just sort of look at the governments and say, well, they should do it, because we have to ask ourselves the question. This again gets back to what I said right at the beginning. What is ethics about? It's about how ought I to live? What ought I to do? Certainly I can vote for candidates who will form a better government, a government with higher ethical principles, if I can find them. But in the meantime, what's stopping me from reaching for my checkbook or my credit card and finding a really effective organisation and saying, I spend lots of money on things that I don't really need. This money could save the lives of children who are dying from malaria, or could help somebody who's going blind to see again for the rest of their life.
So how do you encourage ordinary people to give more? Or perhaps you shame ordinary people. What do you do to encourage them to give more?
I try to make people aware of the fact that there's the opportunity to give more, and that this can be a fulfilling and rewarding thing to do. Not just that people might feel guilty about not doing it, but that it can actually be something that gives a lot of meaning to our lives, to know that we're able to help so many people. And I also look at some of the reasons why people don't give, and I try to meet those reasons and those objections.
I said we'd come back to the sort of military strike that might take place in Syria. We talked about a limited strike. One White House spokesman in the last few days said it would be a discreet war, which I've been places like Afghanistan and Iraq. I was there in Iraq in 2003, and I've seen cruise missiles come down on a city like Baghdad, and I think it's rather obscene to say that cruise missiles could be discreet. What do you think of this sort of language that's coming out right now?
I think that's pretty awful, because clearly if a cruise missile hits in your neighbourhood, there's nothing discreet at all about it. I really wonder, whether he meant that word at all. It doesn't seem appropriate. But we've had this for a long time, of course. We had it in Iraq with the collateral damage expression, which I think is also an obscene expression for saying we are killing significant numbers of civilians in order to achieve targets which often were not critical targets either. So I think the attitude to the deaths and maiming of civilians through these surgical strikes, so-called, is something that really, if it was your children or your families who were the collateral damage, you would think about very differently.
And I'm sure we're going to get the cockpit videos or the nose cone of the missile videos again, making war almost like a video game.
Yes, that's right. In a way you can't help but admire the technology that can do this. And I suppose if you knew that, let's say we established that the Assad regime was responsible for this, and let's say that you knew that here was Assad walking all by himself across a big empty square, and you could target him with a missile and nobody else would be hurt, I think that could be defended. But that's just not the way things work.
Of course, war using cruise missiles in some ways is not that different from what President Obama's been doing all his time in office, which is the drone missile strikes taking place in places like Somalia, Yemen and Pakistan. What do you think of that sort of warfare? Because it's not conventional face-to-face combat. In some ways, it seems rather cowardly.
I'm not going to use the language of cowardice here, because if there is somebody who is attacking you and you can kill them without exposing yourself to danger, that seems much better than exposing yourself to the risk of being killed in order to eliminate them. The worry with me, again, is are you only killing the people you're targeting, and do you know that the people you're targeting are really the people who are guilty of attacking you or of conducting terrorism against you? So
you have the method of assassination by remote control, but then there's a really high burden on the intelligence gatherers to actually provide the right targeting information.
An extremely high burden, that's right. I think if you know that somebody is trying to set off terrorist attacks, and perhaps you know that they've been involved with terrorism, they've already got some culpability for terrorism that's taken place, I don't object to your trying to kill them to stop them continuing to do it. That's the kind of war, if you like, that terrorists have chosen to engage in order to do the damage that they're doing to us. So I think you do have a right of self-defense there, but yeah, the burden of intelligence is very high.
Can I move to another part of the Middle East very briefly and get your views on another area that is a big problem, I think, for the US administration, which is Egypt. And it's the whole question of coup or revolution. And you have a country that has all seen the same event, which is the removal of President Morsi, but is completely divided on what actually happened, whether it was a coup, an elected president being removed and he should have stayed on and served his term, or a man whose policies had angered the whole nation and there was a popular uprising and the army was only doing what the people said. What's your view of that and how other nations should respond to it?
I don't believe that acting on the basis of a popular uprising is democracy. I mean, democracy is about elections. You know, the fact that there were millions of people out in public doesn't mean that a majority of the country wanted Morsi removed. Maybe they did, but we don't know. The way to find out is to have an election. There would have been another election, and I think that would have been the way to find out. If Morsi was unpopular, he would have been defeated. So I do think that if you think that democracy is a desirable political system, or as Winston Churchill said, the least worst political system, then you have to be prepared to stick with it. I mean, there's no evidence that I'm aware of that Morsi was going to cancel all elections, right? I mean, if he was somebody who said, once I'm elected, that'll be the last election, I'll make myself dictator for life, that would be a different matter. Then the military could be justified in intervening. But my reading of the situation is that there would have been another election, that Egyptians would have got a chance to vote Morsi out. And I think that's what should have happened.
Moving from the Middle East to here in the United States, I'd like to get your views on the surveillance and spy issue here, the issue of Edward Snowden, the issue of Chelsea, formerly Bradley Manning. Can I ask you about Edward Snowden? Would you say that he was a hero or a traitor?
I certainly wouldn't say that he was a traitor. I think that we can admire people who have moral principles and stand up for openness. At the same time, we might feel that he has broken the law and that he ought to be prosecuted for breaking the law. That's a dilemma, I think, that people are in those situations. Sometimes you need to be prepared to take the consequences. But we might well decide, in the end, looking back, that what he did was a good thing to do.
I'd like to ask you about getting the balance right in terms of the whole picture. The President of the United States has to do that. How do you balance all of the different demands, the different emergencies? You've talked about trying to get more money from us individuals and from governments of people, but how do you balance all these different demands, all these different emergencies, and how do you prioritise them?
On my ethical view, what we ought to do is look at what will achieve the best consequences. That's the overall framework in which we should reach those decisions. So that's why I emphasise things like global poverty, where I think we know that we could have a very positive impact and we could save millions of lives. So that becomes a priority for me. Other emergencies might get a lot more media attention, but might in fact be less significant in terms of the amount of suffering or loss of lives. They still need to be dealt with, of course, but I think the focus ought to be on where can you do the most good, and then you of course need a lot of good information to know what consequences your actions are going to have.
Do you think the news culture is partly influenced by the way we live our lives right now, by the modern technology, a sort of short-termism of instant decisions, instant headlines, and Obama there surrounded with media advisors at every turn, every hour, lawyers as well? Perhaps he should have a philosopher-in-chief by his side.
Well, it might be nice if he had somebody who directed him about priorities, reminded him, I should say, rather than directed perhaps, reminded him of some of the larger issues that the media is not focusing on. And he does that from time to time. I mean, he made that speech at Georgetown not that long ago about climate change, which is not an issue that the media focuses on, except when there's a Hurricane Sandy or there's some major report like that. But that's a crucially important issue. Again, if you look at it in terms of long-term consequences. There are hundreds of millions of lives, perhaps billions of lives at stake over the next century in whether we deal with climate change. So you do need somebody to remind the politicians that they don't want to be sucked into the short-term media cycle and lose sight of these bigger issues which don't have the same telegenic value, but are the really important things that our leaders need to deal with.
Professor Peter Singer, thank you for talking
Thank
to
you,
Al Jazeera.
James. Good talking to you.